Welcome to a quick discussion of Castlevania the Dracula X Chronicles. For Halloween and the release of Castlevania Nocturne, I wanted to go over my very first classic Castlevania. Castlevania the Dracula X Chronicles was released for the PSP in 2007 and is a 2.5D remake of Rondo of Blood, my favorite classic Castlevania. It was also the first official English release of this game in any form, given that even the Wii Virtual Console version, for example, was just the Japanese version released for the TurboGrafx CD or PC Engine. In general, this game has a much darker tone than the original, with much more serious voice acting and updated character designs by series artist Ayami Kojima, rather than the very 90s anime style of the original Rondo of Blood. When I first played this game, I wasn't actually the biggest fan of it, mostly because of its controls. As someone who had only played Symphony of the Night before this in terms of Castlevania games, it threw me off how difficult it is to actually make specific jumps. Basically, like a lot of other classic Castlevanias, you have to commit to a jump. You really can't change direction in midair once you actually move in a specific direction mid-jump. As a result, I remember struggling quite a bit on my first playthrough of this game, but luckily Rondo and the Dracula X Chronicles have an additional playable character that helps to mitigate some of these issues while introducing challenges in other ways. In general, I'm also not the biggest fan of the presentation. I definitely feel like the sprite work in Rondo of Blood and onwards, because a lot of sprites are reused in the later games, it actually holds up really well. Meanwhile, the 2.5D look of the Dracula X Chronicles actually feels very dated by comparison, so it is a case where pixel art definitely has aged better than early 3D graphics, especially for a handheld. I definitely feel like this game would have potential if they ever tried to remake the game again, but in general, I definitely feel like the original is preferable in some ways. But there's good news, because that is also an unlockable in this game. You can also unlock Symphony of the Night, which has also been redubbed with the cast of the Dracula X Chronicles, and that dub tends to be somewhat polarizing because it tends to be a little bit more serious and less campy than the PS1 dub, but it's still good in its own way, I'd say. Another thing worth mentioning is there are a lot more cutscenes in certain stages like this, where you have boss intros, and I do feel like there's a lot more dialogue between characters as well, because like in the original, you do have quite a few characters you have to rescue, and that has also been overhauled slightly as well. But first of all, let's try to fight this big dragon. Overall, this boss isn't too bad. It is the first boss after all. I actually don't know if there's a way to get to the alternate path for stage 1 with Richter because of his limited jump. I definitely feel like that jump is actually a lot easier to make with the other playable character that we'll be seeing in a bit. Also, a lot of bosses do have desperation attacks, but if you manage to finish a boss with full health, you do get an extra life for your trouble. And like before, you do have to grab the orb at the end of the stage. Another aspect of the presentation I'm a little bit torn on is the music. When I actually started playing this game to unlock everything, it actually caught me off guard how understated some of the music is. I actually think Rondo of Blood has one of the best soundtracks in the series, and it's incredibly impressive for the limited hardware how good a lot of the music sounds. So, in general, the music in this version isn't bad by any means, but it's a very different take on a lot of the songs that were in the original Rondo, and it definitely threw me off at first. But again, I've kind of warmed up to it again. In general, if I am going to play any version of this, I'm going to play Rondo for a few reasons instead of the Dracula X Chronicles. And as a result, I'm definitely a little bit rusty at this version in particular, because some things do feel a little bit off. It's also worth mentioning that the designs for the characters in this version were also used for the Netflix show Castlevania Nocturne. To tell the truth, I haven't even seen the original Castlevania animated series on Netflix, but I've heard that's very good. I've also heard Nocturne is pretty good, but it's also kind of more of a departure, partially because it is a follow-up to the previous show, which did have Alucard as the main character, so some of the plot does play out a little bit differently as a result. But again, I have heard it's pretty alright in its own way, but again, it's not a very strict adaptation of Rondo. In general, trying to adapt the NES games, for example, would be a much easier task because those games didn't have as much story characterization. Meanwhile, with Rondo and Symphony, everything's kind of more set in stone, so I do feel like they have to take more liberties with adapting these particular games, assuming they get that far. As far as I'm aware, it did already get renewed for a second season, so we'll see how far they actually go into the plot of the series at this point. But yeah, as an example, the Behemoth gets a cutscene when it appears. I'm not getting the key, but I've already unlocked Maria in this file, so we're fine. At some point we'll swap over and also jump ahead to show off some of the other interesting additions in this game, because it is not a straight remake in terms of actually keeping everything unchanged. There are some significant differences the farther on you get into this game. In general, I do enjoy it a lot, and again, it was fun to go back to it, but I do prefer Rondo in a lot of ways, and again, a lot of it is visual. I also prefer the art style. Alright, let's try this again. I was definitely expecting to die a few times on this. It is a classic Castlevania after all. It definitely does not pull any punches, and in a lot of ways, this remake is actually tougher than the original. And I don't know if it's just because of the art style, making like hitboxes a little bit less obvious at times, but they have legitimately added some more bosses, for example. For example, we'll talk more about this in a bit, but Dracula actually has a third form, and you can unlock using very specific unlock criteria, basically, that can actually throw you off if you played the original. It's actually kind of sneaky, because there's actually a section that will mess you up if you try to play it like the original. And I actually do respect remakes that do things like this, where they basically take an established scene and then subvert it to create a new experience, even if you have played the original. For example, the Resident Evil remakes are very good at that, by making things slightly off in a way that even returning players to the series will still get caught off guard by a few things. So again, I do find that very fascinating. To tell the truth, I'm not entirely sure if I'm getting past this boss. When I was actually trying to unlock everything again, I got stuck on this boss a bit, even though this is the second stage. As you'd expect, we have this werewolf fight. For some reason, I have a lot harder of a time trying to gauge its attack patterns in this game compared to the original. And again, maybe that's just because of the visual differences, so we might die a couple times on this as well. We also don't have enough hearts to perform an item crash, unfortunately. That would have helped considerably if I had enough, but as is, we'll have to play this fight as you'd expect, without using item crashes to speed things up. So yeah, we're probably going to die here. I actually think this is a good time to head back to the main menu and show off something else. Like in the original, you can switch to Maria Renard as well, who in some ways is kind of like an easier character to play as, and in other ways has her own set of drawbacks to add challenge. That being said, next up I actually want to go to the second to last stage, stage 7, to show off another major difference. Truth be told, I really hope I can actually show this off, and by that I mean, I hope I can get there, because this is not an easy set piece to get through. We have plenty of giant bats trying to stop us as we have to make our way across this crumbling bridge. Like in the original, Bria is essentially an easier character because she does have a double jump, which definitely makes some of the trickier platforming sequences a little bit more manageable, but her downside is I think her attacks are a little bit weaker, and she also takes more damage from everything. So in some ways, she's almost like a glass cannon. We're already almost dead, and we actually just barely got through the first screen, so that's a good example of how much damage she takes in comparison to Richter. And now we have the classic Castlevania clock tower climb with a lot of enemies that we'll have to get past, but basically this stage is really tricky because of a major change to this version that mostly applies to the alternate stages. Like in the original, you can rescue a bunch of characters, Terra, Iris, Maria, and Annette, but saving Annette works differently because saving the other two will give you the power to break through red bone walls like this one, and also a crystal wall later on. You basically have to activate these switches to access a secret passageway to actually enter a different area, because Annette is not where she was in the original, so it's very tricky because of that. We actually don't need the key. I've already rescued Annette on this file, but just to show it off, in the original you have to open this gate and then fight the bird for the key. I actually do need the health, so I think we'll sneak in and try to grab this really quickly and then get out. Again, we don't need the key, but just to show it off, basically as we enter this next area, we'll get to the point where you would actually find Annette originally. If you use the key on that door, you actually waste it and you don't actually rescue Annette, leading to an alternate boss fight against a vampire version of Annette. So it's a very tricky way to kind of throw off people who, again, have played the original Rondo and give them a fresher experience. But again, it is very trollish at the same time, but almost fitting for classic Castlevania to kind of throw a curveball like that. But again, as we get to the bottom of this next area, there is a cell. You do not want to open that cell in the Dracula X Chronicles. You want to keep going and get to a switch behind a crystal wall, and that'll open the actual pathway to Annette. So again, it's very clever, and definitely is interesting as it kind of almost punishes people who are familiar with the original Rondo. But yeah, once we hit the switch, we also have Medusa heads to worry about, which is not my favorite thing. We'll give this one more try to show this off, and then we'll move on to one more thing that is different in the Dracula X Chronicles. But again, you have the two switches, and that'll open up a path lower on to actually get to Annette. In general, I actually do think the character designs make a lot more sense in this game, but again, there's something kind of nostalgic about the very 90s look of the original Rondo of Blood. And again, it is nice though that you can unlock Rondo and Symphony in this game as well, and the weirdest thing about this is those are the versions that are available through the Castlevania Requiem collection on PS4. Basically, that is the Dracula X Chronicles without the 3D remake, and to tell the truth, I'm a little bit torn about that, because again, I do prefer the original, and also by the way, the Rondo version, as you might recall, does have a slightly campier dub, because they actually did two separate dubs, one for the Dracula X portion and one for the Rondo version, just because of how different tonally these games are. So I do appreciate the effort of having a more, like, sillier dub to go with the original graphic style. But again, that opens up this little secret passageway here. But again, it is odd to basically release the game without part of its content, in the case of the Dracula X Chronicles portion being missing from Requiem. But yeah, let's head back to the main menu once more. Finally, I want to skip ahead to alternate stage 5. If I'm not mistaken, alternate stage 5 has actually been dramatically altered from the original. Basically, you have a much tougher stage in my opinion, And in general, again, a lot of the new content is surprisingly difficult. Again, if you can't actually rescue Annette through the alternate passageway, you can actually fight a third form of Dracula, which is incredibly difficult to get past. So, again, if you thought the original Rondo was too easy somehow, as someone who struggles a lot with this game, yeah, you might want to try out the new content just because it is very punishing. So yeah, this is a new Stage 5. Apparently it does draw some inspiration from the original, but kind of reworked in a lot of ways. And in general, I feel like this is very challenging. I think we might end up game overing on the stage if we get far enough, but there is also a unique boss for this stage as well, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, it is also really fascinating. As I was saying, it's really fascinating having a remake change up specific parts of the game quite a bit. There's also a lot of unlockables as well, like there's a bunch of unlockable music you can find, so you might have noticed on the file, even though I had actually gone through everything in terms of the stages, it was still only at like 60%, and that's because there's quite a lot of extra content to potentially find here as well. So yeah, it is probably one of the better fleshed out versions of Rondo as a result. And again, it is kind of a shame that they left it out of Requiem, but on the other hand, I definitely don't feel like I would trust Konami of all companies with like properly upscaling a PSP game to like 1080p or higher. So yeah, realistically, we're not getting very far in the stage. Unfortunately, I probably will not be able to show off the new bonus boss fight for the stage, because, yeah, we're not getting that far. And actually, I don't think Alternate Stage 5 had a boss originally, if I'm not mistaken, or like a unique boss, I mean. So, yeah, quite a bit was added to this particular stage, and it is impressive for that, but again, it is a... As I was saying, this is a very difficult stage, and again, I'm probably not getting through it. But yeah, it's a very fascinating re-release. I kind of wish more re-releases would change up content like this in a way that would subvert expectations for longtime players, but again, I definitely feel like trying again to make a version like this would be fascinating, but it would take so much work. Again, either trying to upscale everything or just redo all the character models, to the point where I definitely doubt Konami would ever do it. And again, I don't think just upscaling the PSP version would be sufficient because of how dated a lot of the graphics look. In general, I definitely do feel like it's pretty impressive for an early PSP game, but again, it just kind of has aged worse in hindsight. And again, that applies to a lot of like early 3D games, especially on handheld, because of like how low res they are in a lot of cases. The PSP's resolution, I want to say, is like under 200p, so a lot of other games have had trouble trying to take that and upscaling that all the way to like, 1440p or 4K, so yeah. There is a risk of the game actually looking pretty bad. As is, again, I've actually warmed up to this version, though again, I definitely still prefer the original. But if you ever have an opportunity to play this game, I definitely would recommend at least trying it, because it is a very fascinating take on Rondo of Blood. And again, if you already like Rondo, it might be fun to see what's different about it. In general, I definitely think I would like more Castlevania re-releases in general, just because a lot of them are stuck on the original hardware, including this, but maybe someday a game like this could also be added to a collection. Like if there's ever like a 3D collection maybe it could be included, but as like a 2.5D game, I feel like that's fairly unlikely. But yeah, we're not getting anywhere close to the boss, and I think I've actually said everything I wanted to say about this game, so I think we'll actually end here. So thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.